Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel, all you beautiful bibliophiles out there. And as the introduction might indicate, today I will talk about books again, something that I have decided I will do more of on my channel. So this is another of those videos. I'm not going to be a full-blown booktuber anytime soon because I will also have other things, but that's going to be one of my things now. Now, me and books. You can see from the shelf behind me might indicate that I do love books and I absolutely adore books. I've always liked books. Been a big reader since I was quite young. Of course, when you start reading as a youngster, you might like your children's books first of all, and then you, as a boy, in my day, it was the Hardy Boys. And also when I was 12, 13, 14, I started getting into fantasy. I would say 14 probably because I had to start reading English before I could really start getting into fantasy. Um, but one thing that actually didn't appeal to me at all when I was young was reading science fiction, which is quite interesting. But I'll get back to that in a moment. So as a teenager, I read a lot, and then I was a student, and then I had to read a lot, and that really put me off for a few decades. The thing is that if you've been a student, you might have felt the same way. You know you have thousands upon thousands of pages you need to read for study for your exam, for instance, and it can be quite a slog if you feel like you're forced to read something, or if you force yourself to read something. And for me, that actually put me off reading for a long time, which is a little bit of a shame, I guess. But at the same time, it also helped shape my tastes in literature because I studied English and comparative literature, and I got to read a lot of really good stuff that I might otherwise have missed if I just stayed in that um, fantasy focused reading that I did. Um, and then I tried starting reading again, but I made the mistake of trying to start reading on Kindle. And I realized later that Kindle doesn't really do it for me. Part of the experience for me is to hold the book in my hand, leaf through it, place my bookmarks, all those things. The feel of a real book is something that is an integral part of the reading experience for me, and without it I feel disconnected from the writing. So it was only a few years ago that I really started getting into reading again, and it was because I started getting paper books again. Books on paper is a wonderful technology. It's one of the most important technologies, and still is and will be for a long time yet. Um, and I started reading poetry first of all, and then I started reading Shakespeare, and then um, something happened, and I'm not sure exactly how this came about. I felt like reading something science fiction, and if you start reading science fiction in the 2020s as opposed to say the 1980s or even the 90s, which I could have done, um, is that you simply don't know where to start. There is so much, and of course science fiction has changed quite a bit. So what is now science fiction is not what science fiction used to be. Um, and I didn't know what I would like, and I didn't want to go around buying stuff without knowing what's what. So there were a few sort of things I decided I should do when I got started, and one of them was to look for short story collections. Now, the great thing about short stories is that you get, or certainly anthologies of short stories, is that you get different writers and you can find out which writer actually writes in a way that appeals to you. It might not be a way to gauge how a writer is universally. It might be misleading. It might be their only good story, potentially. but it gives you a good indication, and because people have different tastes in when it comes to reading, and I certainly have different tastes to, well, everyone, anyone else I know, certainly. So, um, but before I got into science fiction, I did sort of start reading some other things. Like I started reading Lovecraft. I read Lord of the Rings finally. Some other things like that. I read some Murakami, which is one of my big things now as well. But science fiction, yeah. So I wanted to find out where to start, and I went looking on YouTube, as you do, and several places recommended a book by a Polish writer, Stanisław Lem. The Siberiad is the book that sort of kept popping up as the recommended one. The Siberiad, if you have not read this book, I would recommend you read it. This is actually a really amazing book. It's like a sort of modern day, no, not modern day. It's like science fiction, fairy tales or fables. And there are two main characters that go through all the different stories, the different episodes from their life, as it were. It's a bit whimsical. It's not hard science fiction. It's not accurate to real science in any way, but it's philosophical science fiction, so that doesn't matter. It's about concepts, ideas. It's very humorous. It plays a lot with language, and I think one of the reasons why I'm quite liking this as well is that whatever play with language is there in the original feels really well translated into this version, and it must have been really hard, I think, to translate this. I'm not gonna. This is translated by Michael Candle. Michael Candle, who translated this, done a really good, did a stellar job, I might say. The Siberiad, it's the stories are about these two artificers. So these people who have superior technological prowess and knowledge. They are inventors, and they are sort of sometimes they seem to be sort of frenemies. They are friends, but they also have a certain antagonistic relationship in several of the stories, especially in the beginning, which made me believe that they were more antagonistic than they actually were. But they are basically the two cleverest people in the universe, and so they do go around and they solve problems for others. They get tasked with doing something. They do something of their own accord because they have an idea. There's different things, different ways of approaching different stories, but they're all really, really interesting. And also the story that inspired SimCity is in here as well. It's the story of a deposed monarch or emperor who's basically been marooned by his people on an asteroid, and one of the artificers finds him there, and it talks to him, and he realizes that he was ousted because he was such a tyrant. So, but he feels very unsatisfied and unhappy, and the artificer then decides that, oh well, he can sort of make something, a game that will make him happy. So he creates this little miniature world, this box. We have all these miniature little people going about their daily business, and this emperor, he can pretend to be their god and do things and make them do things, and it becomes a whole philosophical thing because the complexity of this box, this world inside a box, is such that one could argue that these people have attained consciousness, and therefore whatever he does to them will be as cruel as what he did to his own people before he got marooned on the asteroid. And it's a really lovely story, and yeah, I would recommend the whole book. Brilliant, Siberia. So other things that got recommended to me, obviously I already knew Ursula Le Guin, and one thing I realized as well early on in my science fiction journey was that I would seek out things that I knew had been curated. So one way to tell that something has been curated by the gatekeepers of publishing is to look out for series of books. So to me, that's a good indication that something has been republished because it has been picked out of a mass of things as something perhaps a little bit more worthy. Not necessarily a good thing, because it could also mean it's more mainstream, which isn't necessarily a bad thing either. But there's a series by Gollancz called SF Masterworks, which you can see the yellow spines over here. And quite early on, I noticed that some of these books that I heard recommendations for, that I'd heard about, were published in SF Masterworks. And I realized that maybe if I wasn't sure what to get next, I might get an SF Masterworks book, and odds were they would actually be good books. Now, I knew Ursula Le Guin from before because I'd read the first book of the Earthsea series, and so I did buy the SF Masterworks Lathe of Heaven and The Left Hand of Darkness, both really good books. But not quite what I would normally think of in what I was expecting, I think, of a science fiction story. But I quite liked both of them as well, even though that wasn't necessarily what I was after right there and then. And then I realized that another approach I could have to science fiction was to find books that I sort of already knew the story. And that was, the first one was, of course, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Philip K. Dick. Which is the book that became the film Blade Runner. And I had heard that the book and the film were supposed to be relatively different to each other. And I thought that was a very good thing, because I don't want to read the book if it's going to be identical to the film necessarily. It might be a little bit off-putting sometimes. So I read the book and I really enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed the differences between the film and the book, and also a book I would recommend because an interesting thing about it is that there are very iconic scenes in the film that are missing from the book, like the tears and rain scene, for instance, at the end. But some of the same concepts, ideas are explored, but perhaps in a different way in the original. And there are additional concepts like one of religion and empathy. And also the whole thing about electric sheep is something that is just completely glossed over in the Blade Runner film, because in the beginning, the actual very beginning of the book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, is Deckard musing about how he would like to have a real sheep. Now that seems a bit weird to start with, but it is explained that it's like almost like a status symbol. For a while it used to be, it seems like it was almost mandatory to have an animal, and so everyone had these animals living on the roof, in the roof garden of their buildings, and a real animal was really expensive. Deckard could only afford an electric sheep, so like the Android version of a sheep bot, if you like. So it looked like a real sheep. It was like a sheep replicant, I guess, almost. Yeah, so it's like a sheep robot, and he didn't let on to his neighbors that it was not a real sheep. It was pretending it was a real sheep. He was doing his feeding cycles and tending to it like it was a real sheep, because he would be seen by his neighbors, and he didn't want anyone to know that it was a fake sheep. But he wanted to buy a real sheep. But of course, another thing in the book, he is married, his wife is spending too much money, and then this job comes along, which is the one you know about from Blade Runner, the film, is that these replicants are loose on Earth. They're not supposed to be there. They're supposed to be in the colonies. And Holden, he is the one who gets shot in the beginning of Blade Runner. He is the one who's supposed to do that job. He's the one who's supposed to retire these replicants. But of course he got shot, so he couldn't do it. Deckard gets calls in, and he can make a lot of money, so much that he's thinking maybe I can even afford a horse not just the sheep, things like that. So there's a lot of things that are missing from the film that are in the book that are quite fascinating things. Another thing that one could think about when this occurred to me actually is that if Deckard was keeping it a secret, he had an electric sheep and pretending it was a real sheep, and nobody knew. Is it possible that his other neighbors also have fake animals? Just want to consider. Anyway, so that was another one that I read. And then there was a little quirky recommendation that was made in another video I saw on YouTube, and it mentioned this book. This is Roger Zelazny, The Dream Master. And I don't think I found this new when I was looking for it. I just found the cheapest copy I could get on eBay, which was actually in, well, it's almost mint condition actually, which I was surprised at. The thing you might notice with my books is that after I read them, they tend to look is the same as when I started, so there's no spine creasing usually, and especially not for small books. So Roger Zelazny, the Dream Master. Now Roger Zelazny, he is very clearly in the way he writes, he is a poet who writes prose. I usually like to refer to him as. The Dream Master also, I didn't know this when I read the book, but later I found out that this is the book that got turned into the film Dreamscape with Dennis Quaid, if you've seen it, 80s movie, which I also quite liked. But again, the book doesn't really have much bearing on the film. In this case, it's even more different than Blade Runner and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? But it's a really good story about this guy who he's a therapist, but the way he does therapy is by going into people's dreams to sort of process things like trauma. What do you call it? Neural participant therapist is the kind of job title he has, and the special machinery and things. I really love the way that Zelazny writes. The risk, if you are somebody who is a poet and you like writing poetically, is that when you take that with you into prose, it can sometimes be too much. And I certainly have stopped reading books or stories that got too flowery, let's say. Somebody was trying too hard to make it poetic. And sometimes I've actually struggled through a little bit as well, because there are times when it's a little bit much, but it's just bearable. And you feel like there's still something worth reading about it. But it's risky, but if it's done right, it can be really beautiful. And also it makes you appreciate reading it again a little bit as well. So Roger Zelazny is one that then got on my radar, because now every time I get exposed to something new, I know that, Ursula Le Guin, science fiction, yeah, that's decent. Philip K. Dick, I realized I really liked, which is why I bought the set of his collected stories, and I've read all of those. I made a video about those before. But Zelazny, just to get back to him again, I encountered him again in this book. This is Nebula Award Stories, volume 10. So that's the 10th Nebula Awards, which would have been, I think, about 1975. Yeah, it was certainly published by Gollancz in 75. This Corgi edition is from 1977. And the nice thing about anthologies is that you get exposed to different writers, and then you can pick out the ones that you like. So this one has stories by Zelazny, by Philip Farmer, Le Guin, Robert Silverberg, and I liked most of them. I liked the Silverberg, particularly Le Guin and Zelazny, I think were the three that really appealed to me in this particular volume. So again, Zelazny showed up. So at the moment, Zelazny, I had him 2 for 2 really, which is a good sign. And then I later read this. This is Lord of Light, which is a novel, and also looking quite mint, even though I have read it. And this is quite a quirky one, because the story seems to be about the Buddha, Prince Siddhartha, and his mostly antagonistic relationship with the Hindu gods, Brahma, Kali, Krishna, etc. So it's a book that is full of reference to subcontinental religion, Buddhism and Hinduism. But it's a science fiction story. Because a lot of what the gods are doing is based on the fact that they have the technology to reincarnate, change bodies. They have these sort of spaceship chariots and weapons that are sort of hyper technological, and they're trying to keep people at a technological level where they don't get to challenge them and their superiority and their control of people. So it's, in one way, it feels like it's set in the future, and on a different planet as well. And it's almost like they're reenacting this idea, these concepts of the gods, the avatars of the gods being in the world and controlling people. But then again, you could also invert that and sort of start thinking about, yeah, but what if that is actually how the gods started in the first place, or the concept of gods is somebody like an alien race, for instance, or a certain subset of people had such advanced technology that they could play the part of being a god to someone. And that's what this whole god thing is about. Philip K. Dick also has several stories about the how something or someone, how someone can turn into a god and how something can turn into religion. And I know he had some kind of vision, some dream vision or something later in life that colored his way of talking about religion. But um, most of his stories about religion, I'm talking about Philip K. Dick now, are based on time travel. So if you can imagine that somebody can travel through time and travel back in time, their presence and their technology would, of course, seem godlike to whoever he encountered, and he didn't have to even have to go very far back for that to be the case. And so it's interesting to see these kinds of stories. As one of them, there's a sort of somebody's experimenting with a kind of space, traveling through space more than time, actually. And one of the test subjects, when he's going through this tunnel through the space-time vortex or whatever it is, he sees these tiny little people, and they look like they're standing up on a hill. It's like this little glitch in that tunnel of space-time that he has to go through to get to work. And he starts communicating with them by sending notes. And it turns out that I shouldn't give it away in case you read it, but it is a nice little sort of story about how he then is seen as a god to these people. So yeah. So yeah, Zelazny was my point. That's actually the main thing I was planning to talk about today. I was just going to make a short little video about Zelazny, and then I ended up talking about so many other things, which I hope you don't mind, because this is the way I make videos. I just go with the flow. I don't script, I don't do anything. I just keep talking, see where I go. So what I want to talk about was that if you like short stories, and of course you have many of these older anthologies around, it's very hard once you discover a writer you really like Zelazny, like Philip K. Dick, to actually find their work, their story work, their short story work. And I think in many ways short stories are the quintessential new age sci-fi, science fiction, I should say, SF expression, because in a short story it's easier to make it about the concept, the idea, the what if. Whereas in the longer narrative, you have to start focusing on characters and what happens to them, and you have to give them conflicts and things. And but you don't need those necessarily for experimental, speculative fiction. And of course, in the shorter format, you can focus almost entirely on the idea. Now, if you like short stories and you like some writers, you might also realize that it's almost impossible to find many of these golden age 60s, late 50s, 60s, into the 70s science fiction writers in collections. I mean, collected works of a single writer. You will find them in random anthologies, but then you feel like you might be missing out on many of their stories that you know exist, but you can't find them anywhere. So I felt quite lucky that when I was interested in Philip K. Dick was just when this set of four books was released. And also when it comes to Roger Zelazny, and I looked him up, there is somebody who's released a 6-book set of his collected stories, collected poems. There are also essays and excerpts from novels. So interesting how the dust jackets create a sort of a continuous design. So it's quite a wide picture that's been different sections put on different dust jackets. I'm just going to show you one of these. So this is a very interesting set of books because it feels like, I think this is something that is made as a passion project, a labor of love by somebody who absolutely adored Zelazny's work and decided he was the greatest of all, and they wanted to collect all his work so that in the future he would be available for those who wanted to read all his stories, because so many stories are semi-lost. People might know that some of the stories exist, but they might be really hard to find because some of them would have been printed only in magazines back in the 60s, 70s, in these quarterly anthologies, New World, New Worlds, Impulse, Spectrum, all different kinds of Andromeda, all these sort of magazines slash paperback publishers back in the day. So Roger Zelazny, somebody decided this is something that is worth keeping, and we need to make sure that we collect everything together, make it into nice books. 6-volume book set. This is the first edition, first printing. I do believe that they have done additional printings. It might still be possible to buy, I think, from the publishers, which is NESFA Press, and I think possibly NESFA Press. I think this is the only thing they do. I haven't double checked that. So it's, as you would expect from a good hardback, is well laid out. Another thing here they've done, which is that they've added sort of notes at the end of the stories where there are notes. They might have added some comments by Zelazny himself where those exist for the particular stories or poems that are presented. I must say I'm not a huge fan myself of authors writing about their own writing when I'm reading the story. So, but what I mean by that is the first time I read a story, I don't want to read an introduction and I don't want to read any author's notes about it because it will change how I see the story. I don't want to know what the author intended me to read before I read it. I might be happy to read it afterwards and get a new perspective on it after I have processed it myself in my own way. And this is also a part of how I just generally view art as well. It is a kind of two-way communication, art, but it's not between the creator and the one who experiences it. It's between the work and the one who experiences it. So when an author has finished writing a story and somebody reads it and they don't know what it's supposed to be about, it might be an illusion. There might be a lot of references to things in it that you don't get, but still you will have your own impression of it. It may make you feel or think in a particular way, and those things are entirely valid and your own impressions of it, and those are what matters. Those are what matter. So this is something that I also experienced when I was a student, and I studied literature, and I used to skip. When I studied English, I very often skipped the literature lectures, and the reason is that our literature lecturers mainly focused on canonical interpretations. So, for instance, what I mean by that is that when you read things like Shakespeare, Shakespeare is canonical. It's a sort of a seminal work in the Western canon. It's very pivotal to understanding a lot of things written later that reference it. But he has been around so long now that you have literally hundreds of years of people writing about Shakespeare, about his work, about their own interpretations of it. And then you go to a lecture in the 1990s, and all you're presented with is an old interpretation of his work. So somebody might say that, oh, Sonnet 18, yes, that is about this and that and that. Full stop. And this sonnet is about that. Yeah, that's it. Which isn't how you're supposed to experience art. You're supposed to view it with an open mind. And of course, all those biographical things, all the topical references, all those things are interesting, but they're not the only valid interpretation. They're just a single valid interpretation of a work. The work stands on its own feet. It's what each individual sees in himself or in the work that matters. And when you are presented with a very fixed interpretation, it's easy to close yourself off to others. It makes it harder to have an open mind. And so while I do appreciate and respect people who view art and the first and perhaps only thought about it is what did the artist intend, and then they try to find out, perfectly fine. For them, that's their subjective approach to it. For me, that is completely irrelevant. I don't even want to know what the artist had in mind. I want to know what I feel and what I think when I see it. It's all that matters. So I think this was, I'm not sure if this was the sort of 50s art criticism kind of concept where you just, the artist is dead, the writer is dead kind of thing. I'm not sure exactly when that's from. It's something that I would have known back when I studied literature, because I did read about this in the theory articles about how one should really, in many ways, ignore the author and just look at the work. Yeah, so there are comments, of course, notes to the works, which can be interesting, but to me is something I want to avoid until I've actually read something and processed it myself, which was the point I was trying to make in a quite long-winded way. I hope you don't mind. So I still haven't read any of these books in this 6-volume set, but I'll just do a shot now. So for the thumbnail, there we are. So I still haven't read any of them. So of course it is possible that all these stories, apart from the 2 novels and the single short story I have read by Zelazny, are absolute rubbish. I find it highly unlikely. I quite like his style of writing. I like his the concepts he explores. Lord of Light was slightly an odd one, but I still enjoyed it. I still went through it rather rapidly. It was not as page-turnery as some other books I read, but still. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today, was actually the Zelazny collection. Still available, I think, from the publishers, priced at around $25 per book last time I checked, but that might have changed now, and maybe it's 30. American publisher, I believe. So yeah, so I'm quite glad to have those, and I will get to them at some point. And when I do, perhaps I will make another video or not, because I'm not sure if necessarily there's anything to add to it, unless I want to make some general statements about his work. Maybe I will make some more videos about Zelazny at some point. It certainly is an interesting writer that I'm guessing there are still many interesting ideas and concepts of his that I will find so fascinating I can't help myself but make a video about them. Right. So in my journey through science fiction, the turn has come to Zelazny, possibly. At the moment, I am in a Murakami phase. I've read most of these books by Murakami up here yet, but I still have a few to go. I'm reading a Murakami book right now. Murakami is another interesting one, and he also has a book that is, I would call, science fiction in the best possible sense, SF. And if people keep talking about 1Q84 as when people talk about Murakami and science fiction, and that often shows up on lists. But the one that I think is really worth reading is, if you want to do Murakami science fiction, is this one. That is Hard Boiled, Wonderland, and the End of the World. That is very much in the vein of new age science fiction, so that's highly recommended. I'm not going to say too much about it, actually. There's two different, it feels like two different parallel stories, although of course they are connected. And there's this guy who, it reminds me a bit of Johnny Mnemonic in a way. So this guy who uses his brain to process and encrypt data. And one of the ways he does that is to, and this is quite a new thing, there's very few people who can do it. Most of them have actually died. And the way he does it is he uses sort of a kind of a part of his mind that he has managed to almost completely isolate from the rest of his mind, to process the data and encrypt it, and then of course get the encrypted numbers back out again. And it's like parallel processing inside his brain, and it has a very special skill when it comes to keeping those separate. So you get, after a while, you sort of understand that half of the story, the one that takes place in a really strange city, is the part of his brain where he's processing, and of course the other one is in real life, if you can call it that. It doesn't matter really in this kind of fiction, in a sort of science fiction setting where he is then processing these numbers and of course talking about that particular thing. So very interesting book. I think it's my favorite Murakami book so far, and by far as well, and also the one that is by far the most science fiction. 1Q84, not so much science fiction really. I think it's almost mislabeled as science fiction. I would still call it just magical realism, to be honest. But there you go, people do call it science fiction. So anyway, it's not that different to much of his other stuff. It's more in that sort of surrealist vein, I believe. Still a good book, a bit longer than it needed to be, on 1Q84 that is, whereas Hardboiled Wonderland is, yeah, it's a perfect book, I think, in terms of length as well. It's 400 pages exactly, in my edition, so good length for a book. Anyway, I'm digressing from my digressions and also from the main point I was making, and so I will leave you for now, and I hope you have a nice day and that you enjoyed this video. And of course, you are all people on YouTube, you know exactly what to do if you want to support my channel. If you don't, then I am sure you will figure it out. And I would appreciate it if you do one or more of those things as well. So I'll see you in the next one, and maybe you want to try some Zelazny. And so far I wouldn't sort of say a clear recommendation of one thing you have to read, but I did quite like The Dream Master. Is perhaps my favorite of his so far, but of course there is a lot other stuff by Zelazny to go through, and eventually I might have another favorite, who knows, but we'll see. Zelazny, recommended, and thank you for watching. Goodbye for now.